Ever get that feeling where the big questions about life, why are we even here? What's the whole deal with just feel like they're floating out there, maybe impossible to truly nail down.
Oh, absolutely.
You've probably got your own mental bookshelf of ideas, maybe some articles saved, trying to piece it all together.
Mhm.
It can feel like a real head spinner sometimes.
It really can. We're
Mhm.
swimming in so many different viewpoints, from ancient wisdom to the latest science, and it's easy to feel like you're not quite grasping the core of it.
Well, that's exactly where we're going today. We're going to try and get a fresh handle on some of these fundamental mysteries.
Okay.
We'll be looking at the work of Dr. Ramesh Kushwaha, specifically his book Physical Universe, Virtual God, and the insights from his chapter, Puzzling Questions of Life.
Ah, Kushwaha. What stands out about his work, I think, is how he blends those two approaches, science and philosophy, to give us a really unique angle on these age-old questions.
Exactly. It's not your typical science versus religion debate. Our goal today is to pull out some of his key ideas, especially his perspective on the virtual nature of some of these big concepts,
Right, the virtual aspect.
and see if we can find a clearer way to think about them without getting too bogged down in, complicated terms.
Sounds good. A fresh perspective is always welcome on these topics.
Okay, so let's jump right in. Dr. Kushwaha starts by looking at how religion often says science just can't touch those major life questions: purpose of the universe, why we exist, who we really are we alone?
That's right. He brings in Sam Harris's thought that these might actually be great false questions.
False questions. How so?
Well, Harris suggests we don't necessarily need definitive answers to these grand inquiries. Instead, maybe we should focus on living our answers.
Living them.
Yeah, like creating the best possible conditions for human flourishing in this life, the one we definitely know we have. It's a very sort of practical approach.
It is practical. Okay, so from there, Dr. Kushwaha shifts to the relationship between science and religion. What's his main take on how these two fields interact, or maybe where they just don't quite connect?
Well, initially, he makes a pretty clear argument that they kind of operate in different realms.
Different domains.
Yeah. Science, as he sees it, deals with the physical world, what we can observe, measure, test. Religion, on the other hand, tends to focus on the non-physical, especially concepts like God or the divine.
But he doesn't just leave it there, does he? Because that doesn't really reflect how most people live their lives.
Exactly, that's his point. He points out that most people in their day-to-day lives actually draw from both, scientific understanding and some form of religious or spiritual belief.
So where's the conflict then, in his view?
His stronger critique seems aimed at the extremes. Those very fervent believers who dismiss science entirely, and the really staunch atheists who reject any possibility of the non-physical. He notes that both sides often insist their view is the only valid truth.
Right, the insistence on exclusivity. So he's laying out these different camps. Then he dives into a really big one: the nature of God. And it's interesting how he reframes the question itself.
Yes. Instead of just asking, does God exist, which can be a bit of a dead end, he poses the more nuanced question, what is the nature of God?
Okay, and that opens things up quite a bit.
It really does. It allows for exploring the different ways God is understood across various religions and philosophies.
And there are definitely a lot of different understandings out there. He touches on, like, the Abrahamic faiths.
Right. Christianity, Islam, Judaism, they generally see God as a personal creator figure.
Mm-hmm.
But then you have traditions like Buddhism and Jainism, which, as he points out, don't really have that concept of a creator God at all.
And Hinduism. You mentioned that too.
Yeah, and Hinduism is interesting because it encompasses such a wide spectrum. You've got the Vedas, which might imply a creator, but then you have Vedanta's concept of Brahman, this ultimate, all-encompassing, impersonal principle.
Okay, here's where it gets really thought-provoking. Dr. Kushwaha then builds on ideas he's discussed earlier in his work.
Right, about the universe itself.
Exactly. He suggests that if we consider the physical universe as something that has always existed and is constantly changing, then the need for a specific creator God becomes, well, less clear-cut.
This is a really key part of his argument. If the universe wasn't created at a specific point in time by an external being,
Then you don't necessarily need that creator figure.
precisely, the necessity diminishes significantly. And this has some pretty big implications down the line if you follow that logic.
Right. So if no creator God is needed in that sense, what are the follow-on effects? What does that imply?
Well, Dr. Kushwaha suggests a few things. First, it implies that God didn't necessarily create or directly control the universe or, what happens in our individual lives.
Less direct intervention.
Yeah. And it also hints that humans might not be a special, separate creation in the traditional religious sense.
Hmm. And what about the problem of suffering, like natural disasters?
That becomes a different kind of question, too. If there isn't necessarily a divine being pulling the strings, then the classic problem of why a benevolent God would allow terrible things, well, it reframes that whole issue.
That's a pretty fundamental shift in how you might approach these things. So if not a creator God in that sense, what does Dr. Kushwaha propose as the true creator? This is where his idea of the virtual absolute self comes in, right?
Yes, the VAS. He introduces this idea, he also calls it the virtual core self, VCS, or sometimes just the soul with a capital S.
Meaning pure consciousness,
Wonderful.
like Brahman or Atman.
Exactly. He argues that the real creator, the one we actually directly experience, is the force behind the virtual universe within each of us.
Okay, so it's an internal creation, not something external building the physical world.
Precisely. Think of your mind, maybe, like a super sophisticated computer simulation, and this virtual absolute self, or VAS, is the underlying operating system, or maybe the programmer. It's constantly generating the virtual reality you experience.
The reality I perceive.
Yes, it's always being created and recreated within us, providing our awareness, our consciousness. He emphasizes that this internal virtual world is the only universe we can truly know directly.
And this virtual universe isn't fixed. It's always changing, moment to moment.
Absolutely, it's in constant flux. Then he connects this virtual creator within us back to those religious and philosophical ideas.
Like pure consciousness, the self or soul.
And Vedanta's concept of Brahman or Atman, he sees them as different ways of describing this fundamental inner awareness, this principle of knowing.
Okay. So with this idea of a virtual creator, how does Dr. Kushwaha address the question of whether God is real? It sounds like he's not talking about a physical being out there somewhere.
That's right. He's quite clear. He suggests there's no physical God who created the universe and actively runs it. No specific being will meet in a literal heaven after we die.
And if there's no literal heaven,
Then consequently, he also proposes that there's no literal hell either, at least not as physical places of reward or punishment in the traditional sense.
but he doesn't completely dismiss the idea of God, does he? He introduces this concept of a virtual God. What's the point of that? What does that mean?
It's about the effect of belief. He argues that if believing in this virtual God, whether you call it Jesus, Buddha, Krishna, Allah, or just higher power, gives someone hope, courage, strength, love, purpose, happiness.
Then that belief has real value.
Exactly. It has tangible benefits in a person's life. He shares a really powerful story, actually, about a woman.
Oh, yeah.
She had attempted suicide multiple times, was really struggling, but then she had a vision, some kind of spiritual experience that gave her a renewed sense of purpose, and it saved her life.
Wow. That's a really striking example of how belief can have a real measurable impact. It sounds like he's saying these psychological and emotional effects are what truly matter.
Yes. Regardless of whether there's a separate physical being behind that belief.
Right.
He kind of wraps up this point by highlighting the power of positive thinking, essentially. The belief itself, even if it's generated within our own virtual reality, can have very real and positive effects on a person's life and well-being.
Okay, that makes sense. Now let's tackle those classic biggies, the purpose and meaning of life and the universe. Starting with the universe itself, what's Dr. Kushwaha's take on its purpose, if any?
Well, he suggests that the whole idea of a purpose often implies a beginning and an end, right? A moment of creation with a specific goal in mind.
Like building something for a reason.
Exactly. But if the universe, as he proposes, based on some scientific ideas, has always existed and is constantly evolving, then it might not need a specific, predetermined purpose beyond simply existing and changing.
So it just is.
It just is, and it's constantly becoming something new. It's more about maybe endless possibilities unfolding rather than heading towards some fixed final outcome.
Less of a grand cosmic blueprint and more of an ongoing, ever-changing process. That's quite a different feel.
It is. Then when he considers the purpose of life, he makes an interesting distinction between a universal level and an individual one.
Okay, what's the difference he draws there?
On a universal biological level, if you just look at nature, the primary purpose seems pretty straightforward. Live and reproduce. Keep the species going.
The biological imperative.
Right. However, on an individual level, he really stresses that each person is free to choose their own purpose in life. Your personal goals, your passions, what drives you.
And these don't have to conflict with the biology.
No, they don't have to. And importantly, he adds, our individual purpose shouldn't limit what others choose to pursue either. There's room for everyone's chosen path.
That makes sense, a fundamental drive,
Yeah.
but with individual freedom layered on top. What about the meaning of life, then? That feels like a much more personal, subjective question.
It is. And Dr. Kushwaha argues that meaning isn't something inherent in the universe itself, waiting to be discovered like a hidden treasure.
So where does it come from?
It's something that living beings, with our subjective experiences and intentions, bring to the world. We assign meaning. He uses the example of the shivling.
The Hindu symbol.
Yes, a stone that's carved and worshipped. The stone itself is just a stone, but through human intention and belief, it becomes imbued with profound meaning. It shows how we are the source of meaning.
So meaning isn't out there waiting to be found. It's something we actively create or assign through our consciousness.
Precisely. It's the act of giving significance that brings meaning into being. It's a unique capability of living creatures with subjectivity.
And then, why are we here? How does he answer that one? It sounds like he ties it back partly to that basic biological imperative.
Yeah, on a fundamental level, his answer is fairly direct. Procreation and eventually death. You know, the circle of life, as he puts it.
Live, reproduce, die.
Basically. But he also goes beyond that, pointing to our potential for learning, growing, making a positive impact, experiencing the whole range of human emotions: love, joy, sorrow, connection. These are also parts of why we're here, what makes life rich.
The question of where we go afterwards.
He acknowledges that's still a deep mystery, the whole afterlife versus reincarnation debate. He doesn't claim a definitive answer there.
Okay. Now let's shift gears a bit to a question that always grabs our attention. Are we alone in the universe?
Ah, yes, the search for E.T. It certainly does capture the imagination. He briefly summarizes the scientific search.
SETI and all that.
Right, and the current situation. Lots of searching, intriguing possibilities, but no solid evidence of extraterrestrial life yet. Though he notes the ongoing optimism within the scientific community, simply because the universe is so mind-bogglingly vast.
The odds seem like they should favor other life existing somewhere.
Mathematically, maybe? But scientifically, the book is still open. But here's where Dr. Kushwaha adds his unique perspective again.
He pivots, doesn't he?
He does. He shifts the focus inward. He suggests that even without contact with alien neighbors, humans possess these incredibly advanced brains.
Our own complex inner universes.
Exactly. And we have the ability, he argues, to tap into what he calls ultimate reality, or pure consciousness, that VAS or VCS we talked about earlier. This internal potential is so vast, he proposes, that perhaps the question of whether we're physically alone becomes, well, less crucial.
Interesting. So an inner exploration that's maybe just as profound as the outer search.
That seems to be his angle. Let's move on to rebirth and reincarnation, a central idea in many Eastern philosophies, but less so in the West. How does Dr. Kushwaha approach this?
Yeah, how does his virtual framework handle that?
Well, he starts by contrasting the Eastern ideas of reincarnation with the typical Western religious concepts of a one-time life followed by heaven or hell. He also mentions the Christian belief in Jesus' physical resurrection as another viewpoint.
Okay, setting the stage.
Then he brings in the straightforward scientific view. After death, the physical body decomposes, its matter gets recycled back into the environment. Atoms return to the earth, the air.
So a kind of physical rebirth in a purely material sense. The stuff gets reused.
In a way, yes, matter is conserved. But when it comes to the soul, or consciousness, he focuses specifically on the Vedanta perspective, and this is crucial. He describes the soul, Atman, VAS, pure consciousness, not as a separate tangible thing, but as a principle of knowing.
A principle, not an object you can, point to. That's a key distinction, isn't it?
Absolutely fundamental to his argument. He explains that virtual entities, or principles like this, don't necessarily follow the same rules as physical objects in the physical world.
Okay.
He uses a helpful analogy. Think of gravity.
Right.
Gravity is a principle, a fundamental force present in all physical objects. But gravity itself wasn't born, and it doesn't die in the way a star or a planet does. It just is.
It's a property of the universe.
Exactly. Similarly, he argues, Atman, or the soul, as this principle of knowing, is ever present as the potential for awareness in living creatures.
So if the soul, as a principle, doesn't really live or die in the conventional sense, then what does that mean for rebirth or reincarnation?
Well, he argues that the concept of rebirth doesn't really apply to something that doesn't fundamentally begin or end. while the principle of knowing is no longer manifesting through a particular creature when it dies.
The principle itself continues.
The principle itself is eternal, just like gravity exists whether or not a particular apple is falling. So rebirth of the principle is kind of meaningless.
What about the question people always ask? If souls aren't reborn, how do you explain the growing population? Where do new souls come from?
He addresses that by pointing to the infinite potential of the virtual world. A new creature, when it's born and develops consciousness, essentially taps into or gets this ever-present principle of pure consciousness VIS. It's not like a finite supply of individual souls being created or recycled.
Ah, okay. So the potential is always there, and new life accesses it. That helps clarify the idea of a principle versus a finite object. Now let's loop back quickly to heaven and hell, considering this understanding of the soul as a principle of knowledge.
Exactly. If the soul, or pure consciousness, is understood as this fundamental principle of knowing, this potential for awareness,
Then the traditional idea of it as an individual entity going off to heaven or hell for reward or punishment,
becomes kind of irrelevant, doesn't it? There's no separate thing to make that journey or face that judgment.
and this also changes the perceived role of prophets and religious leaders, I guess.
Yes, from this particular perspective, prophets aren't necessarily needed to, say, guide individual souls to a heavenly afterlife, because the soul, as a principle, isn't bound by those kinds of destinations.
It's not traveling anywhere.
Right. He emphasizes that the confusion often arises when we instinctively think of the soul as a concrete individual entity, like a little person inside us, rather than this underlying principle of awareness itself.
So the main point is, the soul, as a principle, is eternal, but it doesn't travel to separate afterlife realms.
That's his interpretation based on Vedanta, yes.
Okay, that leads pretty naturally into the idea of ghosts. If the soul isn't an independent entity that survives death and floats around, what does Dr. Kushwaha say about the existence of ghosts?
Well, following that logic, he states quite clearly that ghosts, in the traditional sense of spirits of the dead interacting with the physical world, can exist as physical or even independent non-physical beings.
Why not?
Because the soul, or Atman, or pure consciousness as he defines it, doesn't exist independently outside of a living creature capable of consciousness. It's a potential that requires a functioning system like a brain to manifest.
So what are ghost sightings then, in his view?
He sees them primarily as creations of the human mind, illusory virtual entities generated by our own consciousness, perhaps due to grief, fear, expectation, or even neurological factors.
So more of a psychological or perceptual phenomenon than something genuinely supernatural you could, bump into.
Precisely. While he acknowledges that the idea of ghosts can be comforting or exciting for some people.
Sure, the desire to connect.
Right. He stresses that they aren't tangible beings that can interact with the physical world in the way they're often depicted. He suggests that belief in ghosts often comes from a desire to connect with something beyond our normal experience or find meaning, but encourages a critical look, recognizing the power of our minds to create vivid illusions.
Got it. Now, Dr. Kushwaha also touches on consciousness, specifically in Buddhism. How does his concept of soul pure consciousness relate to or differ from Buddhist teachings on the self?
That's an important comparison he makes. He draws a distinction between his idea of an underlying eternal soul, or pure consciousness, Visatman, and what Buddha described as the empirical self, or ego-s.
The sense of me we usually feel.
Exactly. Buddha saw that sense of I as more of a temporary virtual entity, something that exists during our waking and dreaming states, but dissolves in deep dreamless sleep.
So not a permanent core.
Right. Dr. Kushwaha notes that Buddha viewed this ego as constantly arising and disappearing moment by moment, a continuous flickering process within this lifetime, not an enduring entity.
Okay, a very fluid and impermanent sense of self in Buddhist thought. How does that differ from this more enduring, pure consciousness, Vasatman, that Kushwaha talks about?
Well, for Buddha, consciousness itself, which he described maybe paradoxically as being void of a fixed self but still containing mental objects like thoughts and feelings, is what undergoes a kind of rebirth within this life, this cycle of arising and passing away. The ultimate goal is nirvana, which is the cessation of this cycle, the extinguishing of suffering.
So a different focus.
A different focus and perhaps a different definition. Dr. Kushwaha suggests that what Buddha refers to as consciousness in this context might be closer to what Kushwaha calls phenomenal consciousness, the stream of experiences, whereas Atmanbhas is the underlying pure consciousness, the fundamental principle of knowing itself.
Okay. Subtle but important differences.
Yes. And he also points out, quite rightly, that Buddha's primary practical focus was on understanding and reducing suffering, leading to the development of powerful meditation techniques.
Right, the practical application. Okay, let's talk about the limitations of science, which is another key point Dr. Kushwaha brings up. What are the aspects of life that he believes science, as we currently practice it, can't fully explain or study?
He argues pretty strongly that science, particularly the hard sciences like physics, chemistry, and mathematics, isn't really equipped to fully study and explain the purely virtual subjective aspects of our lives.
Like what, specifically?
Things like our emotions, love, hate, jealousy, joy, our sense of morality, what's right and wrong, and our deeply personal experiences of things like beauty, suffering, happiness, the taste of coffee, the feeling of awe.
Why does he think these fall outside the primary reach of current science?
Because fundamentally, these are experiences that can't be objectively measured or quantified in a consistent way. There's no universal love-o-meter or suffering scale that gives the same reading for everyone.
Right, my experience of red isn't necessarily yours.
Exactly. He highlights how incredibly variable these experiences are, not just from person to person, but even within the same person at different times or in different contexts. He uses the example of how we all perceive and react to pain differently.
Yeah, tolerance varies hugely.
Hugely. And he even touches briefly on how this inherent subjectivity makes things really complicated for systems like the law, which try to apply objective standards to subjective experiences like emotional distress or suffering.
It really highlights that gap between the objective, measurable world and our inner, personal, virtual experience. Now let's dive into the intriguing concept of virtual free will, as Dr. Kushwaha explains it. How does the virtual nature of our experiences relate to our sense of having free choices?
He connects it back to the idea we discussed earlier that our self, the VES or ego I, that temporary virtual entity,
The one that experiences the world.
right, that self has the ability to assign flexible meaning to the virtual objects and events within our internal world, within our consciousness.
Flexible meaning. How does that lead to free will?
Well, this flexibility, he argues, is what gives rise to subjectivity and intentionality, our ability to have perspectives and make choices based on them. This, in turn, underpins our experience of having free will. He uses simple examples, like one person might get a paper cut and barely notice it, while another person reacts really strongly. Same physical stimulus, different internal meaning assigned, different reaction. Or, you really want that piece of cake, but you choose to skip it for health reasons. You override an impulse based on a different chosen meaning or goal.
So our ability to interpret and then act on our interpretation of these virtual experiences, that's where the sense of freedom comes from.
Exactly. Because our experiences are filtered through and assigned meaning within this virtual realm, we have the freedom, or at least the powerful feeling of freedom, to choose how we interpret them and how we respond. That gives us that sense of agency, of being in the driver's seat.
Okay, that's a fascinating way to think about free will. Finally, let's explore Dr. Kushwaha's thoughts on miracles and miracle healing. He seems to make a distinction here, doesn't he?
Yes, he does. He's quite skeptical about purely physical miracles that supposedly violate the laws of physics.
Yeah.
Conjuring objects out of thin air, things like that. He suggests those are much more likely to be illusions, tricks, or misinterpretations.
But he's more open to other kinds.
He's more open to the possibility of miracles related to the physical body, particularly unexplained or rapid healing.
Interesting. What's his reasoning behind drawing that line?
He argues that each person's self, that VES, has an inherent, though often untapped, capacity to influence and even trigger healing processes within their own body, the mind-body connection, essentially.
Okay.
And external influences, whether they're strong religious beliefs, interactions with charismatic healers, placebos, or even just powerful positive suggestions from others, can significantly affect our virtual beliefs and thoughts.
And those virtual beliefs can then impact the physical body.
That's the idea. They can indirectly impact our physical state, potentially triggering or accelerating the body's natural healing mechanisms in ways we don't fully understand yet. He mentions many anecdotal accounts of pain disappearing seemingly instantaneously through spiritual practices or faith healing.
And he emphasizes the belief itself.
Yes. He stresses that the power of the belief seems to be key, perhaps more so than the specific content of the belief system itself. Believing something positive will happen seems crucial.
So it's the internal shift in belief and focus, potentially triggered externally, that can then influence the physical body's ability to heal itself.
Precisely. He highlights the documented positive impact of things like prayer and meditation on health outcomes,
Yeah.
and gives examples like people reporting profound experiences of relief through faith-based practices, mentioning things like placebo effects power or figures known for healing touch.
And the source of the hope doesn't matter as much as the hope itself.
That seems to be his main point here. Whether the source of hope, courage, and purpose is a traditional deity, a spiritual leader, a philosophy, or even just strong self-belief, the existence of those positive virtual states is what can have a powerful effect.
Okay.
He concludes by noting the generally accepted impact of positive thinking on health and well-being, how positive thoughts can create, you could say, virtual patterns or entities that influence the body physiologically. Even if science is still working out the exact mechanisms for these subjective virtual to physical links.
So to kind of wrap this all up, what's the main takeaway you get from Dr. Kushwaha's whole exploration of these huge, puzzling life questions?
For me, the central insight is really his intriguing perspective on how this proposed virtual realm, our own consciousness, our beliefs, our subjective experience, profoundly shapes our understanding of everything, including these fundamental mysteries.
It offers a unique way to bridge, or at least look differently at, the gap between science and spirituality, doesn't it?
It really does. By examining the nature of consciousness, belief, and our inner world through this virtual lens, he gives us a novel framework.
And while he offers some really compelling ideas, some fascinating angles, it's clear that many of these answers aren't like definitive pronouncements. They're more like tools for thinking.
Absolutely. His work provides valuable frameworks for our own personal contemplation, rather than offering simple, one-size-fits-all answers to questions that humanity has wrestled with for millennia.
So maybe here's a final thought for you, the listener, to mull over. How does considering the potential virtual nature of your own consciousness, your beliefs, maybe even your sense of self, how does that change the way you approach your own search for meaning and purpose in life?
That's a great question to sit with.
We definitely encourage you to dive deeper into Dr. Kushwaha's work, if this sparked your interest, or explore other related philosophical and scientific ideas out there. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us today.